Change. It's something that we can accept or not. This was a year that made the 90s instead of feeling like the 80s like in 1990. How did this provocative year change so drastically, destroying the 80s pop culture? Well, I'll be discussing about it in extras in the 90s video on 1991, but in the meantime, let's discuss about what gaming in 1991 was like. Well, this was a year that my brother was born, and this was actually the year that I played my very first video game, and if you've seen my videos, you know what I'm talking about. But for those who were old enough to remember this year, there are just so many things that came out in 1991 that's simply unforgettable. And I've been looking forward and discussing about the year 1991 for quite a while. In this episode of Gaming in the 90s, we will find out if Sega continues bashing on Nintendo as an inferior product, how will Nintendo respond to Sega's ad campaign, and how good are many of these games that came out in this very year. We'll see it all in this episode of Gexup's Gaming in the 90s. The year is 1991. Well, we're trying to make this episode a little different by saving the best parts for last, because I want to end this episode on the perfect note. On the last episode of Gaming in the 90s, we finished it with PC games. Well, in this episode, we're going to begin with the PC gaming community in 1991, and most likely, we have a lot of PC games that earned itself sequels like Police Quest 3, The Kindred, Wing Commander 2, Vengeance of the Karathai, and Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge. But I want to get into more revolutionary titles for the PC. One of them is the game that totally revolutionized strategy games forever is a game called Civilization. For those who never heard of Civilization, it's a turn-based strategy game that takes the role of a ruler of a civilization, starting with only one settler unit, and attempts to build an empire in competition with 2 or 6 other civilizations. Along with the larger task exploration, warfare, and diplomacy, the player has to make decisions about where to build new cities, which improves the unit to build each city, gain new knowledge in advancing technology, and how to transform the land surrounding the cities for maximum benefit. You can build whatever you want with no hurry, make risky choices to benefit your empire, and develop as a stronger nation in order to beat the game as you rule it thousands of years from the Stone Age to the future. Whenever you begin the game, everything you haven't traveled is pitch black, and in order to be seen is to move your troops to all sorts of areas and build up your empire and encounter other civilizations and secrets. This is the very game that made Sid Meier's a household name in the whole video game community, and it's because of this ambitious game that changed the formula of what we were used to in video games that put a staple on strategy games. The reason why I'm not a big fan of 4X strategy games is because they're all imitators of Civilization, and it's a Civ series that still to this day make any difference with the subgenre. And that's a fact. If you're not a fan of strategy games, I still recommend this game because it's so easy to get into, it's very educational on economy and governmental power, and most of all, it's highly addicting once you play it. Speaking of addicting games, another game title that has changed the formula in video games is Lemmings. This is finally a puzzle game that doesn't add blocks to destroy other blocks like every other Tetris clone, but instead the goal is to guide at least a certain percentage of green-haired, blue-robed lemmings from the entrance all the way to the exit by clearing and creating safe passage through the landscape for the lemmings to use. Unless assigned a special task, each lemming will walk in one direction, ignoring any other lemming in its way, except for blockers, falling off any ledges, and turning around if they hit any obstacle that they cannot pass. This is a game that requires a lot of quick thinking because everything is happening in real time, which means you have to keep an eye on every lemmings because they will die when they're falling on great heights, falling into a lava or water, disappearing off the top or the bottom of the screens, being caught into a trap, or being assigned to a bomber skill. And finally, the last PC game I want to mention is actually one of my favorite 2D platformers of all time. And no, it's not Duke Nukem. It's Another World, or in North America, Out of This World. This is the one game that single-handedly expanded the cinematic platformer subgenre that was left off from the original Prince of Persia. Another World was innovative in its use of cinematic effects in its graphics, sounds, and cutscenes with characters communicating through facial features, gestures, and actions. It's so creative with its environment, death sequences, and puzzle variety following the progressive narrative of a character you play as, Lester Knight Chaikin, adventuring through a new dimension. This cinematic style granted Another World cult status amongst critics and fans. And I'm still amazed that this game was just made by one single man, Eric Chahi. There isn't anything I can add that's anything new because I've already reviewed this game, but if you still haven't played this game yet, you owe it to yourself to check out this masterpiece, because this is the one game that made cinematic styles in video games possible, and to this very day in video games, we still follow this game design whenever there's a video game today that has a story and follows a narrative. Now that we got PC games out of the way, let's talk about a gaming platform that we missed out on the last episode. Arcades. Arcade gaming has been up and down throughout the 90s because classics like Strider blew everyone's mind, and when consoles were capable enough to play arcade games, like the Sega Genesis, it made more players to prefer playing those games at home. As much as you can just save your quarters just playing at home, there's nothing similar to playing games in the arcades, where you can meet new people, see how other players play the game, beating high scores, and even multiplayer that goes over 2 players. I wish I was born a little earlier because I was too short to play any arcade games throughout the 90s. So what arcade games were we all playing in 1991? Well, one of the biggest machines that got every young gamer the desire to play was definitely Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. The arcade version had a total of 4 players where each player can either play as one of their favorite turtle, and like every beat-em-up game, you scroll to the right and occasionally stop at certain parts of the level just to beat up some enemies. What every Turtle fan will always remember about this classic is the level variety to travel through New York City, to time warp to each time era, and fight countless foot soldiers, and at the end of each level they fight their favorite villain as a boss fight. I can't count the ways of how many times I played the arcade version of Turtles in Time when I first unlocked it as a bonus in TMNT Mutant Nightmare, even though I was more familiar with the console port from the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. It's arguably one of the best beat-em-up games of all time because it's everything that we want in the Turtles game plus more, that even a remake could never even overshadow this classic. But that was not the only beat-em-up game that we were playing in the arcades, because Capcom wasn't even finished with their business with arcade games. One arcade game that was released in 1991 was Captain Commando. Now what makes this game hard to choose this over TMNT Turtles in Time is that it's a beat-em-up set in the futuristic world. You have a futuristic superhero called Captain Commando, assisted with 3 faithful commando companions rise up to protect the Earth and all the galaxies from the gang of superpowered criminals. Sounds like a cheesy concept, but what really shines this game is, of course, the gameplay and the animation quality that made this beat-em-up so enjoyable. You have a lot of great imaginative variety of levels, creative enemy designs, huge surprises, and even play up to 4 players simultaneously. It's very similar to Final Fight, so if you're a fan of that game, you're in for a treat. But we don't remember Capcom in 1991 for just Captain Commando now, do we? We all remember Capcom's greatest accomplishment when they finally released the ever-so-beloved Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. This is the very game that set the standards of the whole fighting game genre, because you have the privilege to choose any of the 8 characters: Ryo, Ken, Chun-Li, Blanca, Honda, Zangief, Dhalsim, and Guile. The ability to select the stage, more buttons, better movesets, and even balance, all of which suits each of the player in a one-on-one fight, and it did it much better than all the previous fighting games before it. Words cannot describe how popular this game still is today, because it got everyone around the world to start coming to arcades more often and play with their friends and strangers to see who's the better fighter. It was so huge that this very game made $1.5 billion in revenue, meaning not only how many arcade machines were sold, but also how many people spent their quarters just to play this game. Hell, even to this day, fans around the world love to participate in Capcom's Street Fighter II's World Tournament each year. I'm definitely one of those kids who grew up with this game and still enjoy playing it with others today. It still remains Capcom's best-selling video game they've ever made, and still to this day, Capcom continues to make remakes, additions, improvements, and new characters for later Street Fighter II ports to make the experience better and better. But since I mentioned that there were other versions of Street Fighter II, 2. Just to let you know that in the future episodes of Gaming in the 90s, I will not mention any of the ports because I'll just be repeating myself about the same game from this episode. So just to get that out of the way. It's Street Fighter 2 that was so revolutionary that it started the fighting game boom throughout the 90s that even other video game companies took inspiration in creating more fighting games or just simply ripped it off. And believe me, there are a lot of Street Fighter 2 rip-offs throughout the 90s. And to my surprise, I can't believe that in less than a year, we just had a new fighting game that's trying to compete against Capcom's masterpiece, and that is SNK's Fatal Fury King of Fighters. Now, should I count this game as an arcade game or a console game, because both the arcade and the Neo Geo port of Fatal Fury was released the same year? Either way, despite the fact that Fatal Fury is quite similar to Street Fighter 2, it did have high quality animation, much more combos, and better movesets. But the downfall of this game, which is the reason why it can never approach to the awesomeness of Street Fighter 2, is that you can only choose 3 characters: Terry Bogard, Andy Bogard, and Joe Higashi. And they all have to take on Duck King, Richard Mayer, Michael Max, Tung Fu Ryu, Huai Jai, Raiden, Billy Kane, and Geese Howard, all of which are more interesting than the 3 characters that you can only choose. But that's forgiven because SNK learned from its mistakes and fixed the problem in the later Fatal Fury sequels and the future games that they made throughout the 90s. Now that we are on the topic of console gaming, I think I should pick the TurboGrafx-16 to go next, and boy, do they have plenty of great games that they've released in 1991. You guys remember Bunk from the last episode? Well, he made a sequel that's superior than the last, and that is Bunk's Revenge. Now, Bunk has taken back half of the moon from the evil King Drool and his evil dinosaurs. What made this a huge sequel is that this installment of Bunk has much more enemies coming in after you and has much better animation than the last game, which adds even more quality on the challenge and gameplay standpoint. Of course, what Bunk is most known for is his power-ups, and the new power-ups are much better in Bunk's Revenge. Jump into the real deal of meat. Bunk can power up to freeze enemies, shoot out fire breath, super ground pound, and invincibility for a short period of time. New to the series is that whenever you reach to the end of the game judges on how much you collected or explored, because you'll end up in a monster train where they reward you an extra heart container, power up, and maybe a special warp. I love the fact that this game rewards you on collecting and exploring that creates a lot of replay value. Another great game from the TurboGrafx-16 is Hudson Soft's Bomberman. This is a resurrection to the maze game genre since the direction of side-scrolling abandoned the formula from the 80s. The player takes time to think and act patiently to destroy the blocks that blocks you from destroying your enemies, and reveals random items and power-ups that gives you greater advantage to defeat your foes, even though letting the bomb goes off takes some time, and also it can get you killed once the bomb hits you. But where the game really shines is of course the multiplayer. And I'm telling you straight from my childhood that Bomberman is my favorite competitive multiplayer game of all time. It was an amazing console multiplayer game that could go up to 5 players, and I had countless sleepovers where my friends and I were obsessed with the multiplayer with not only the first Bomberman game, but all the Bomberman games. Whenever there's a Bomberman game, I automatically want to buy it and get someone to come over to play it with me, even despite the fact that the game is the same game as the first, because the formula is impeccable. This game was so popular in Asia that Hudson Soft released those marble shooting Bomberman toys to expand the franchise. And now we come back to the rivalry with Sega versus Nintendo. Now, I know it was my fault to start on the last episode with Sega and Nintendo, because throughout the whole episode I just kept mentioning the 2 companies, even though there were some parts of the video that I shouldn't. So it's best to leave both of them at the last. Let's begin because they're really starting to respond to Sega's ad campaign by even adding more games than they ever released before. I so totally missed the Game Boy in the last episode because really there weren't really any good Game Boy games released in 1990. But in 1991, Nintendo was taking a huge swing for their handheld system. The Game Boy had brilliant titles released in 1991 such as Castlevania 2, Belmont's Revenge, Final Fantasy Legend 2, and Final Fantasy Adventure. We also had Kid Icarus of Myth and Monsters. It blows my mind that this Kid Icarus game was so much better than the first one on the NES because you can see your character much better and the animation quality is much better than ever. Also, my frustration with the first one was the hatred difficulty, but in Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters, everything is so suitable and balanced that I can't ask for any more, except that if you know the game too well, that you could probably beat this game in less than 2 hours. Another NES game that has its sequel on the Game Boy is Metroid 2: The Return of Samus. Now, this has been remembered as the Black black sheep of the Metroid series because it took the series to a different direction by making it much more linear, by instead of fighting new weapons and abilities at secret areas, Samus follows a narrow world to commit genocide on the Metroid, which grants her those powers to go up against enemies. I can't really blame Nintendo for making this move because of the limitations for the Game Boy cartridge. However, this game is still great, featuring new abilities such as the Spider Ball, Space Jump, Spazzer Beam, and Plasma Beam, and also the feature of some of the best boss fights ever been seen on the Game Boy system. But of course we have to mention the most revolutionary title out of the Game Boy, and it is the very first-person shooter, Faceball 2000. Originally this game came out for the PC, however Faceball 2000 on the Game Boy was a huge thing because of the animation quality, though black and white still have a lot of well-made frame rates, but we should never forget about the multiplayer feature. Pop question: what was the only way that you could play multiplayer on the Game Boy? The answer? The multi-link cable, where you can play up to 4 different Game Boys. Well, even though there weren't that many Game Boy games that has multiplayer that uses the multi-link cable, Faceball 2000 was actually one of the first games that actually utilizes this technology in order for the multiplayer on this portable system to work. Nothing much more I can say about Faceball 2000 other than it's just dodgeball in 3D. You turn around like a tank and you just move forward, like the early first-person shooters back in the early 90s. At this point, Nintendo was nearing its end with the NES, but they were still giving one swell swoop by releasing more games for that system. Rare has released one of the hardest games ever created, and we should all remember Battletoads. Though they do resemble a lot with the Ninja Turtles, what makes Rash, Zitz, and Pimple, unique characters is that as they beat their enemies senselessly, they occasionally use their body parts to morph into giant weapons of some sort, such as a giant boot, hammer fist, and more. But of course, what made this game so infamous is its reputation as one of the hardest games of all time. Never was there a game that has so much that's going so fast that it can kill you in an instant, and may I remind everyone that when you play in co-op, you can actually hurt each other. That never happens in a beat-em-up game. And I know that I mentioned that I'm not going to go through sports games, but I have to make this an exception because this is the first game that actually felt like a real sport game, and that is Tecmo Super Bowl. It was the first sports video game that has the licensing privileges with both the leagues it sought to emulate, the National Football League, and the Players Association, the National Football League's Players Association, thus allowing the game to use both names and attributes for real NFL teams and real NFL players. And also, you get a chance to strategize on how you want to play offense and defense the way that has been seen in real life sport. Even though the Sega Genesis had the big names on sports to make it to a video game as its appeal, but they never before had a sports game that has the name's roster, which is a mandatory thing in sports games today. And now we have Sega, and boy, do they know how to keep the competition going, because 1991 was the year when they displayed the usage of the so-called blast processing. 1991 was a huge year for Sega because they put all of it on the line by making so many exclusives for that system. You got yourself a wonderful sequel called Golden Axe 2, where it plays more or less the same like Golden Axe. For those who don't know Golden Axe, and I'll be surprised if you never heard of it, it's a side-scrolling beat-em-up set in a high fantasy barbarian setting where you get to choose either the dwarf, the barbarian, or the she-barbarian, and you have to fight your way through monsters, demons, and other weird creatures resembling to the high fantasy theme. As for this installment of the series, though there were barely any improvements over the original, overall it felt like the game had small changes, made it a more refined and enjoyable experience despite the lack of real character or technique improvements. But wait! It gets better! We also have Phantasy Star 3, and this is as well a split opinion amongst fans because it paled compared to the first two Phantasy Star games, mainly because of the slow pace that bores a lot of players, its departure from the series into space, and the characters were so bland and unmemorable. The real problem was that this game was made by an entirely different team of Sega, and as a result, it just failed because they were trying to make their own game. But wait! It gets better! If Phantasy Star 3 disappointed you, don't worry, there's a game that pays a whole homage to the series, which is Shining in the Darkness. It is a brilliant dungeon crawler RPG that should have been Phantasy Star 3 instead because of the familiar dungeon crawling exploration, sweet and memorable combat, well-detailed graphics, and the epic story. Back then, Sega was hyping up this game as the superior to all RPGs of the style, and I wouldn't go to that far to agree with the hype, but it's just that Shining in the Darkness was a huge homage to RPGs in the Sega Master System. However, the series will later make a drastic change by making it a strategy RPG with the following Shining Force. But wait! It gets better! If repetitive fights from beat-em-ups and RPGs is not your thing, then check out Mercs. It's an over-the-top, over-the-head shoot-em-up that has so many things flying at you and continues to blow so many things off from the screen. What caught my eye on this game is that even though there were so many things going on, not once did the frame rates drop because the machine could just handle everything that was going on and keep running the game. But wait! It gets better. You know, in 1991, we had so many beat-em-up games, so I guess I have time to at least mention one more game from this genre. Streets of Rage. This Sega classic is quite similar to Golden Axe, except this game is set in modern day, fighting street gangs, similar to Double Dragon and Final Fight. Instead of having a dwarf and two barbarians to choose to play as, you have ex-cops fighting in the streets against gangs hanging around the cities with choices of Adam Hunter, Axel Stone, and Blaze Fielding. Characters will pick up weapons and use them against enemies, and what's so cool about this game compared to all the other beat-em-ups is the backup force that shoots out missiles on screen to wipe out everyone except the players off to their deaths. And to get even better games, Sega has released Toe Jam and Earl. This is an over-the-head action-adventure game, where the gameplay is similar to a dungeon-crawling classic called Road, where you could play Toe Jam or Earl in single-player or co-op, and your object of the game is to collect pieces from your wrecked ship while avoiding Earthlings such as the Phantom Ice Cream Shucks, aggressive pack of nerds, giant hamsters, boogeyman, man-eating mailboxes, and police chickens. This game might not look as much, but it is fun to play because the exploration and the humor keeps the players engaged. Plus, it's kind of fun to see our characters to be aliens dressed as rappers, even though Sega was trying to get to an even larger number of people to get into the Sega Genesis, because hip-hop was the shit throughout the 90s. It's a game that not everyone's gonna like, but if you're like me that loves adventuring in a video game, you can't miss this out. And finally, the best game that Sega could provide for the Sega Genesis in 1991. For the longest time, Sega has been using big-name celebrities to sell their console, but since so many celebrities have already made their game and have no interest in making more, it was about time for Sega to start their own mascot. Already, Alex Kidd was a failure for mass appeal, so they need a character that was sharper, more edgier, more appealing, and much more faster. And it was about time for Sega to release this mascot to compete against Nintendo's Mario. And this character was going to be everywhere relating to Sega. And come on people, you know what it is. It's Sonic the Hedgehog. During its release, Sega was hyping up this character wherever Sega could reach just to make this character a Mario killer because Sonic the Hedgehog was supposed to be the fastest thing ever seen in video games. Well, up to this point, it was a video game character that runs fast and a high speed, which totally excited not only Sega fans, but also people around the world. As for the gameplay, it totally delivered where our character Sonic goes off to chase Dr. Evil Robotnik from capturing innocent creatures. Sonic the Hedgehog added element of momentum-based physics to the standard platform formula and introduced unique elements such as loops, springboards, high-speed devices, and rings now permanently associated with the series. Though the high speed contributed to the mix, the execution of platforming elements influenced the developer of various 2D video games, including a subsequent wave of familiar mascot-based platforming games. I mean, still to this day, everybody still talk about how good this game is because it's arguably one of the best 2D platformers ever made, and if you never heard of Sonic in your life, I'm sorry, but you lost your privilege in calling yourself a gamer because everyone in the gaming industry knows Sonic the Hedgehog. His image single-handedly changed both Sega and the gaming industry, and it is the one game that made the Sega Genesis the best-selling console of 1991, and that is a fact. Now, this is how Sega put its money where its mouth is, and Nintendo began losing in the gaming market up until Sega responded to Sega's silly slogan from Genesis does what Nintendo don't to Genesis does what Nintendo is now doing. And they finally released the ever-so-beloved console called the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It was about time for Nintendo to enter the 16-bit technology and take full advantage of making games exceeding new levels. When the Super Nintendo was released in North America, it included 2 controller ports and a copy of Super Mario World included with the Super Nintendo. Another Super Mario game? We just had Super Mario Bros. 3 last year, didn't we? Just how did they make a sequel so fast, you may ask? Well, Super Mario Bros. 3 was originally released in Japan in 1988, and in North America got it in 1990, but ironically, Super Mario World was released the same year we got Super Mario Bros. 3. But back on the Super Nintendo, though it was a huge surprise to have Super Mario World released already, if that wasn't enough, you also have F-Zero, Pilot Wings, SimCity, and Gradius 3. Dude, that's 5 superb launch titles, and I still wonder why whenever there's a new console launch nowadays, we have to wait for over a year to have really great games. And I'm looking at you, Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii. Now let's talk about my favorite Super Nintendo games released in 1991. Of course, we all have to talk about Super Mario World. Super Mario World was so awesome that we didn't need another Fred Savage movie to tell us how good it is. It is definitely my favorite game of 1991 because never has there been and since a Mario game that excelled at so many new levels of creativity and variety. This is probably my most replayed game because I never got tired of playing Super Mario World. This was a huge game because it introduced us Yoshi, which is now one of Nintendo's most lovable characters. Mario is visiting Dinosaur Island to once again save Princess Toadstool, but once again, you travel through countless landscapes to pass through hundreds of enemies. I absolutely love this game because it is twice as bigger than Super Mario Bros. 3. Having Yoshi as a feature was a huge thing because this powerful dinosaur can swallow enemies in an instant, making him a helpful and useful character. But what's heavily improved is the overworld map, where they can have so many secrets to unfold, and the levels you complete changes the map depending on how you complete the level, because some levels they have different ways to exit the level. What's also an improvement over Mario Bros. 3 is that you can replay any of the levels that you have already finished, because in Super Mario Bros. 3, once you finish the level, you cannot return to that level unless you had game over and had to restart the whole map. Every time I pick up Super Mario World, I always feel like a kid again, and I always keep reminiscing the familiar graphics, the level design, and the memorable sound coming out of the game. So you have to understand where I'm coming from when I'm calling this my favorite game of 1991. In my opinion, no other Mario game has ever given me so much, and so very often whenever I play a new Mario game, I get kind of disappointed because they don't offer as much as Super Mario World does. I know it was kind of biased to say that, but that's how I really feel every time I play any new Mario game nowadays. I've been playing this game since I was a baby, and still to this day, this game has never, and I mean never, lost its appeal for me. Another revolutionary game that was released on the Super Nintendo is a classic called F-Zero. It has been acknowledged by many as the game that set the standards of the racing genre, and F-Zero will always be remembered for its fast-paced and challenging gameplay, variety of tracks, and extensive use of a graphical mode called Mode 7. I forgot to mention that the biggest difference between the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo is that the Super Nintendo has Mode 7. Mode 7 is a graphic mode that allows the background layer to be rotated or scaled on a scanline by scanline basis to create many different effects. The most famous of these effects is the application of a perspective effect on the background layer by scaling and rotating the background, plus creating a third-dimensional graphical effect. And throughout the Super Nintendo's lifespan, many games used the Mode 7 graphics just to add the third-dimensional perspective. And to my surprise about F-Zero is that they managed to use the Mode 7 graphics at an insane level by making it so fast, and not once has the frame rate dropped when there's so much going on. And what about the Super Nintendo version of SimCity? Since it was developed and published by Nintendo, despite the fact that the gameplay is more or less similar to the original on the PC. This is another game that abandoned the formula of destroying every enemy on sight and focused on simulation building. And believe me, I've met a lot of people that put a lot of countless hours on this port of SimCity just because it was so much better than the PC version, which featured graphics changing to match the seasons, civic reward buildings, and you also got Dr. Wright, also known as Will Wright, the creator of this game, to be your advisor whenever there are problems or something that needs to be learned about this game. In addition of the NES version of SimCity, it also has two big bonuses that no other port has, like the statue of Mario, and definitely having Bowser to invade the city acting like Godzilla. And what about Super Ghouls and Ghosts? Man, talk about one of the hardest games of all time. This action platform game is the third game in the Ghosts and Goblins series, and you take the role as King Arthur to once again rescue the princess from countless demons. Or what about an even better game, Super Castlevania 4? Now this game blew everybody's mind because it scared many gamers but also excited every Castlevania fan because this was something totally new. This is arguably one of the best Castlevania games ever made in the series. While Super Castlevania 4 features the same plot and premise from the first Castlevania game on the NES, it also has 11 new stages, expanded play control, 16-bit graphics featuring the SNES Mode 7, and the soundtrack featuring brand new pieces and remix based on the previous Castlevania music, all of which were all necessary to make the fourth installment of the Castlevania series, especially for the series entering the Super Nintendo. And what about ActRaiser? If simulation building from SimCity is not your type of thing, prepare yourself for some of the best games ever made, because this game is both an action platformer and a city building game that combines traditional side-scrolling platforming with an urban planning god game sections. This is the game where you play as the Master, the main protagonist of the game, although when you're in city building mode, the player plays as an angel during the simulation sequences of the game in the overhead view that involves protecting and guiding the Master's new civilization towards prosperity to the humans trying to survive against monsters and demons. The portion of the game requires the player to take control and encourage growth of the population, including road planning and using lightning, rain, sun, wind, and earthquakes as miracles. One obstacle in the simulation mode is the presence of flying monsters trying to attempt to attack the progression of a civilization. And I have to agree with some people who doesn't really like this game that it's kind of annoying that while you're city building, you also have to be fighting these monsters invading your town. But what makes it worth it is that when you finish all the tasks in the city building mode, you get a chance to play in the side-scrolling action sequences that many people most remembered about this game. And may I remind you that this game also had some of the best boss fights that has ever been seen on the Super Nintendo? And what about an even more epic game? Final Fantasy II, or in Japan it's originally Final Fantasy IV. This is where Square has started to skip numbers just because there were certain games on the Final Fantasy series that never made it out of Japan. But despite this old problem that Square has been doing, the one thing that Final Fantasy IV will always be remembered is that it pioneered many common console role-playing games features, including the whole new concept of dramatic storytelling in a role-playing game. Many people who absolutely love this game praise this game for its graphics, gameplay, and definitely its score. It's also the first role-playing game that featured a complex and involving plot, rather than selected bland heroes out to do a quest. There were so many iconic and unforgettable moments in this game that I still can't believe that it still holds up to this very day. This was also the first Final Fantasy game that Square introduced an active time battle system, which differed from the turn-based design from the previous role-playing games. The active time battle system centers on the player inputting orders for the characters in real time during battles. This system was used in many of Square's games where each character has their strength and weaknesses. For instance, a strong magic may lower defense, while a physical fighter may have lower agility. And it's also the first Final Fantasy game that employs the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 technology to enhance magic spell visuals to make the airship travel more dramatic by scaling and titling the ground for a bird's eye view. This game is not just good for being just another Final Fantasy game, it's just that the execution on this very game was made so dramatically that it also changed role-playing games from here on out. And finally, I want to mention just one last game in this episode of Gaming in the 90s, because this next game is actually the first game I have ever played, and that is Pilot Wings. I remember the time when my grandfather told me that this was the first time I've ever played a video game, and he loved the fact that he and I used to play this game a lot together. And no other game in my mind could ever cry out nostalgia better than Pilot Wings, because this was also a very suitable, yet easy to get into flight simulator, where the whole game is a series of training exercises of a flight club, where you get a chance to fly on the light plane, go skydiving, fly on the rocket belts, and also hand gliding. And this game could never be done anywhere else but the Super Nintendo because of the perfect usage of Mode 7, where it not only focused on scaling and rotating around to create the third dimensional effect, but also it focused on altitude and height, where you can go as high as possible and also land on the ground realistically. The game at the time drew praise for its presentation with the publications describing the game's use of Mode 7 graphics as stunning and jaw-dropping. Its level of challenge is so positively noted as a great exercise for flight simulation in general. And in my personal opinion, I think that no other game that uses Mode 7 graphics more better than Pilot Wings. And the more I play this game, the more I realize how great it is to be a long-time gamer because of the beautiful score and the relaxation of playing this game. You might not agree with me that this game is that great, but it's challenging no less, and I absolutely love playing this game again and again whenever I get the chance to reminisce my early days of playing video games when I was a young lad. And I'm very happy to end this episode on the Super Nintendo because, to be quite honest, the Super Nintendo is my favorite Nintendo console ever. From here on out, they've released so many classics that are simply unforgettable, so many amazing ideas that has never been done in gaming, and from here on out, they create more and more innovations, not only just for that system, but also in gaming in general. And I hope that everybody enjoyed this episode of Gaming in the 90s, because 1991 was such a great year. And if you want to hear me talk about even more great things that came out in 1991, and believe me, there are a lot of really great things that came out in 1991. Check out the video below on Extras in the 90s to see how unforgettable this year was. Till then, see you on the next episode of Gaming in the 90s.